Here's Trent Horn to give some weak rebuttals to atheist memes.
We've covered awful atheist memes before, and we're going to do it again here on the Council of Trent. So why wait? Let's jump right into it. Here's the first meme. On the fourth day, God created the sun. If God created the sun on the fourth day, how the hell had 4 days passed? What's hilarious about this meme is that there's a variant of it that's at least 1,600 years old. St. Augustine argued with Gnostics who made this same objection to the Bible, which is why Augustine said that the account of creation in the book of Genesis is not a literal description.
If it's metaphorical, what is the metaphor intended to represent exactly? What did the author of Genesis intend to metaphorically convey by talking about what God did on various days?
Instead, Genesis is a thematic description, showing God creating all the realms and populating them with different creatures. That's why Augustine said God made everything in a single instant, and that, quote, the sacred writer of Genesis was able to separate in the time of his narrative what God did not separate in time in his creative act.
But why? What was the point? If God created everything in a single instant, which the text doesn't say at all, why wouldn't Genesis just say that? This is yet another example of the supposedly perfect scripture of an omniscient, omnipotent God, sounding as though it was written by someone with the communication skills of John Hurt before the facehugger fell off.
Next, we tried a Christian society run by the rich. It was called the Dark Ages for a reason. So in this meme, we have an image of an execution that shows someone being killed by having their limbs tied to horses who run off in different directions. What's funny about this meme is that this is a medieval painting, but it's depicting a killing of Saint Hippolytus in the 3rd century, which was, of course, during the Roman Empire and 200 years before the so-called Dark Ages, which weren't really that dark because it was the church that kept Western civilization going by copying ancient manuscripts after the fall of Rome.
Well, it wasn't just the church, it was also the Muslim scholars along the Tigris and Euphrates that preserved a lot of it. And while religious folks preserved the older stuff, the problem was that they didn't produce nearly as much stuff of their own as the ancient Greeks and Romans did.
Here's the next one. Dear religious people, don't worry, when atheists become the majority, and it will happen sooner than you think, we will treat you far better than you have treated us when you were the majority. You know, I really want to believe that, except when you look in the past at what happened when militant atheists ascended to power, like in the Soviet Union or Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge, it didn't turn out very well for religious people.
The word militant is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Also, these were dictatorships that had few, if any, constitutionally promised rights, or institutions able or willing to protect individuals and minorities. In countries that do have protections for minority rights, religious folks would do just fine. Japan, for example, is already majority atheist or agnostic, and religious folks get treated just fine there.
And of course, let's not forget about secularists today who want to ban so-called hate speech and take children away from their parents just because the parents don't want their children mutilated by so-called gender reassignment surgery.
I've never heard of anyone having their kids taken away because they refuse to sign off on them getting gender-affirming surgery. I've heard of kids wanting to escape their parents because their parents refuse to respect their gender identity, so they go to the government to help them escape, but that's not the same thing as the government taking the kids away. Also, even if social workers were taking kids away, why do you connect that to atheism? Do you think all social workers are atheists? Do you think even a majority of them are atheists? There are plenty of atheists who oppose trans rights and plenty of Christians who favor them. Most of the folks who make and enforce these child welfare laws are Christians who simply don't agree with your interpretation of Christianity with respect to this issue.
Finally, there's no guarantee that non-religious people will be the majority globally in the future. That may happen in the United States, but some projections show that globally non-religious people will decline overall due to low birth rates, and that the fastest growing global population are actually Muslims.
That argument would be more convincing if atheism were hereditary. Sure, being born into a religious family increases the likelihood that a person will also be religious, but I'm pretty sure that atheists haven't increased their numbers and proportion of the population in the US by outbreeding everyone else. Globally, they may not be growing right now, but if they do in the future, it likely won't be because of their birth rates.
All right, now let's look at two memes that both use the argument from geography for atheism. Think of a God you don't believe in. Determine which standards of proof this God does not meet. Apply those standards of proof to your own God. Wonder why you didn't see it sooner. And this one, there are almost 5,000 gods being worshipped by humanity, but don't worry, only yours is right. The biggest problem with these memes is that they don't define what the word God refers to. God, for these critics, is just any super being people worship. But that's not God. God is the infinite act of being itself, unlimited in power, knowledge, and goodness.
What is the infinite act of being itself? What do you mean by power? I don't know what power refers to if it isn't referring to physical power. Also, given that God is your standard of goodness, to say that God is unlimited in goodness is a meaningless tautology.
God is not a being in the universe. God is the ground of being, so God is infinite in all respects.
Well, you don't really believe that God is infinite in all respects. You only think he's infinite with respect to what some apologists call grape-making properties. You don't believe that God is infinitely stinky or infinitely perverted.
The reason I don't believe in Thor or Zeus or Buddha, who isn't a god in Buddhism, by the way, I don't believe in these creatures is because they're finite beings.
Is every god other than Yahweh regarded as finite? Is Parabrahman, the supreme Hindu god, not infinite? Is he not also considered the ground of all being by Hindus? And the Bible talks about other gods. Do you not believe in them either because they are finite beings?
I believe in God, and these beings are not God, no matter what you call them, because they are limited and finite. In their respective mythologies, these beings often come into existence, they change, they're ignorant of some things, they are thwarted, and sometimes they do evil. The fact that they exist in time shows they are not God, because God made time itself.
Which doesn't make any sense, by the way. You can't make something at a time when it already exists, and there was never a time when time didn't already exist.
Since these mythological beings are not pure actuality, they are not God.
None of them? Are you really sure that of all of the gods whose existence you reject, not a single one of them is defined as pure actuality?
They may be super beings, but they are not God, which is why I don't believe in them, because I believe in God. I agree with classical theists like Aristotle and Jewish and Muslim philosophers that there is one infinite God.
Infinite in what sense exactly? He's not a physical being, so he's not infinite in mass or any other physical characteristic, including power, which is also a physical attribute. As I mentioned before, it is meaninglessly tautological to say that he is infinite in goodness, given that he is your standard of goodness. It means nothing more than saying God is infinitely godly. So in what sense is he infinite?
We may disagree about how God revealed himself to humanity, but we can agree that one infinite God does exist. Moreover, atheists can't say, I must reject the God of the Bible because he sounds like a god of mythology in some parts of the Old Testament. That's because I interpret the Bible in accord with what reason tells me about God.
So do I. That's how I came to the conclusion that God can't exist.
So if I know from reason that God cannot have a physical body as part of his divine nature, because God created all material things from nothing, then that means the Bible's descriptions of the Father having a body must be non-literal. There are examples of God giving humans a non-literal image of himself, which is called a theophany.
What would the point of that be? If God is not physical, why even metaphorically represent him as walking around the Garden of Eden, for example?
Finally, this meme can backfire on atheists. Imagine you're at a party and 95 out of 100 people there say they heard a loud noise outside, but they disagree on what the noise was or what it sounded like. Would you agree there was at least a sound, that the 95 heard something, even if they disagree about it? Or would you agree with the 5 people who said there wasn't a sound at all?
Neither. I'd remain agnostic while I investigated whether anything happened that could have made a sound that they described.
Now, large groups of people can be wrong about things, but they're usually more often correct than incorrect, which counts in favor of large groups of people at the bare minimum rejecting a strictly material atheistic view of the universe as being the common consensus of human experience.
With respect to God, I have been investigating such claims for decades, and the more I look, the more it seems to be the case that this is one of those instances in which the majority is wrong.
All right, here's a classic meme that continues this mistake of confusing God with other beings. God can't exist because of Eric, the God-eating magic penguin. Since Eric is God-eating by definition, he has no choice but to eat God, so if God exists, he automatically ceases to exist as a result of being eaten. Unless you can prove that Eric doesn't exist, God doesn't exist. Even if you can prove that Eric doesn't exist, that same proof will also be applicable to God. There are only two possibilities. Either you can prove that Eric doesn't exist or you can't. In both cases, it logically follows that God doesn't exist. I would just ask, what is meant by Eric being a penguin?
It's hard to tell exactly what this meme is getting at, but I suspect that it is a criticism of apologists who say that you can't prove that God doesn't exist, as though that constitutes an argument that God does exist. You can't prove that the penguin doesn't exist.
If he has feathers and occupies space and time, then he's not God.
I don't think the meme is saying that the penguin is God. The meme seems to be saying that proving the penguin doesn't exist would be proving a negative, which is sometimes impossible to prove. However, what this meme misses is that only synthetic negatives, negatives that are not tautological, cannot be proven. Analytical negatives, negatives that are tautological, however, can be proven. Since existing means having location in space-time, it is true by definition that any concept that has no referent in space-time represents something that does not exist. To say that something exists without inhabiting space-time is to say that it exists nowhere and never.
And if he's a timeless, spaceless penguin, then he's not a penguin, because penguins, by definition, are a kind of physical, temporal bird.
And if God is timeless and spaceless by definition, then God, by definition, exists nowhere and never, which means the same as saying that he does not exist at all. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.